Hi, everyone. We are here today to discuss the impact of toxic exposure on Indigenous land and tribal communities.
Hi, my name is Alex Pompey.
I'm Michelle Cooper.
I'm Jessica King.
And I'm Alexa Mugler.
The Columbia River Basin in the United States Pacific Northwest is home to numerous indigenous tribes that have hunted and fished on the land for centuries. The land is also home to one of the largest nuclear waste Superfund sites in North America, the Hanford Nuclear Site. The Hanford site was selected as a plutonium production site for nuclear bombs in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project and remained in operation in some capacity until 1989, when it was determined the site was a significant source of contamination for the surrounding areas. Of the several Native American tribes who regularly hunt and fish there, the Yakama have been vocal in their efforts for both site cleanup and acknowledgement of the health impacts the site's contamination has had on their people. Despite those efforts, cleanup of the site has stalled due to disagreements between the Environmental Protection Agency and the other state and local groups tasked with navigating this very large and expensive project. Hanford is considered to be one of the largest and most contaminated sites in North America. And based on predictions, the Hanford site cleanup will take until at least 2090, with an estimated cost of over $100 billion. While state and federal agencies struggle to adhere to this timeline, 6 reactor tanks have begun leaking into the soil with no mitigation plan in sight, adding to the existing contamination and increasing the risk of toxic exposure for tribes like the Yakama. In addition to man-made disasters like the Hanford site, tribes in the region are struggling with habitat destruction due to climate change, which has had a significant impact on both food and habitat. Specifically, the salmon population has begun to decline, which means this primary food source for the tribes like the Yakama are both diminishing in number and potentially unsafe to consume. In both of these cases, salmon, which are a significant aspect of tribal culture, have been turned into an unreliable resource either by depletion or toxic contamination. Salmon are not only a primary source of food for the indigenous people of the Columbia River Basin, but also symbolic of the spiritual connection they have to the land. The treatment of both land and the indigenous people that live there exemplify the common practice of indigenous erasure and oppression, but also offer an opportunity to examine how a social work intervention and support model can be applied to the benefit of these communities.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, so when we look at the demographics of the indigenous communities, we find that according to the 2020 census, there are roughly 458 people living among the Yakama Nation reservation. Out of all of these individuals, there is an average age of 53.7 years old, and only 32.2% are 65 and older. If we break this down more, there are 46 American Indians and Alaskan Natives living within the community, 2 Asian individuals, 1 individual is African American, 35 are Hispanic or Latino, there is 1 Native Hawaiian, and then there is 365 non-Hispanic and Latino individuals and 369 white individuals. The indigenous tribes have lived among the Columbia River Basin since the 1880s when they first discovered the land. However, this was put in jeopardy in 1855 when the Yakama Indian Tribe War started because the U.S. force wanted to clear their territory for other settlers, which they felt violated the treaty that was set up in place. The war lasted from 1855 until 1859. In 1859, after the war ended, the treaty was upheld by the U.S. force, and the Yakama tribes were able to keep their land, which currently is roughly 1.130 million acres. Since then, they have used this land to hunt and forage for food, and they live off the land, and this has become their main way of living ever since the 1800s. They have passed this ideal down from generation to generation, and the culture believes that salmon impacts their health and spirituality, and it connects them to their creator. Among the Yakima tribes, there are four tribes: the Nez Perce tribe, the Confederated tribe of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Warm Springs of Oregon, and the Yakima Nation. There has been significant impacts of toxic exposure due to the salmon. The toxic exposure in the Columbia River Basin has created serious health risks such as infertility issues, immune deficiencies, heart issues, and the OPB and ProPublica conducted a study that found that mercury, PCBs, and dioxins were found within salmon. They even conducted a study looking at cancer, since 1 out of 100,000 people within the nation can develop cancer. By finding out this information, they took the dose of probable carcinogen and multiplied it by a cancer potency factor.
Thank you, Alex. Additionally, on this slide, we included a photo of another toxic waste dump to show how these policies end up creating toxic waste dumps within Indigenous communities. In Dilkin, Arizona, this recycling plant was sold to the Indigenous people as an opportunity for jobs, land growth, and something that would benefit the communities economically. However, as you see in this photo, it really just became a toxic waste dump for corporate interests and still affects the people in Dilkin, Arizona today.
There have been a number of policies and procedures put into place over time that have had the guise of assisting the indigenous tribes, but ultimately have negatively impacted them. Over centuries, tribal communities have been impacted negatively by environmental protection policies and laws that fail to account for their needs and perspectives. The indigenous tribes that have been asked to have a voice, but then when they voice their opinions and thoughts, they are ignored and not taken into account. There are many policies currently in place that are harmful to those of indigenous communities and do not allow for their tribal sovereignty. Due to the lack of policy change being in favor of the indigenous people and tribes, it is likely that they will continue to remain marginalized with the continued conservation management of their land and resources. There have been some protections that have been put into place with the attempts to assist tribes over the years. One of the protections is the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, also known as SARA, which requires tribal governments to be given the same status rights as a state. With the protections of SARA and the Executive Order of 13084, they called for meaningful consultation with tribal governments for the official cleanup of the toxic sites. When this act and order were put into place, there was an actual policy stating that the tribal recommendations had to be implemented and that the decisions or items that were found during the cleanup process had to be shared with the tribal communities. Along with those, the U.S. Department of Emergency have abandoned the toxic waste that has been left behind, and rather than clean it up, they have reclassified the waste from high radioactive levels to low radioactive levels without the Environmental Protection Agency, Washington State, or Oregon State knowing about the reclassifications. While there have been many of these policies put into place, they are still continuing to negatively impact a way of life for the tribes from their land, their food, and their livelihood, and the government is not supporting them at this time. There is some hope, though, with the Environmental Protection Agency stating in 2023 that they plan on investing over $17 million for projects and programs to assist in reducing some of the toxins in the water sources and the fish population, as well as addressing climate change.
Thank you, Jess. So moving forward to our next slide, once it loads, is a blown up image of what you saw on that previous slide that dives a little bit deeper into some of the issues at the Hanford site, some of the history behind those issues, and some of the suggestions for moving forward that Jess mentioned. So as Michelle spoke on, the cleanup is expected to last decades, and this projection shows that the cost is estimated to be between another $300 and $600 billion. Obviously, there are definite ways we can do better, and there has been a long-lasting impact of this toxicity within the soil and the groundwater, as well as the Columbia River. So moving forward, if we are able to advocate as social workers for some policies that can contribute to speeding up this timeline, we can prevent the tanks seen here continuing to leak into the soil. And we can also advocate for a quicker cleanup scheduling. So it says here that the full treatment capability is not scheduled to start before 2036. A primary strength of Indigenous communities is a focus on the self and the individual connection to the land and community. Alex spoke a bit about that. And when we talk about that, Indigenous beliefs emphasize the four aspects of self: mentality, spirituality, emotionality, and physical health, rather than specific illnesses or disease. These communities value honor, trust, humility, and resilience. Their goal is to have a respectful relationship with the land, and clearly it is very difficult to have that when these are the conditions at hand. As social workers, we value the core values of service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of relationships, integrity, and competency. When we're working with Indigenous tribes and other Indigenous communities, it's important to hold space for that cultural competence and uplift their voices when we are advocating for policy and putting different policies into place. The NASW emphasizes the importance of additional intrinsic work when we serve vulnerable populations, and we have to embrace our role in combating discrimination, oppression, racism, and social inequities. Another step that can be taken to engage these communities is to engage with youth and raise awareness about Indigenous advocacy, empowering the next generation.
As social workers, it's our role and responsibility to consider situations like the one the Yakima are facing and use it as a reminder to apply a culturally responsive approach to our work at all times. At each level, from individual to community to state and federal government, there are opportunities for social workers to advocate for Indigenous communities. We can begin by ensuring individuals are empowered to speak out about oppression and mistreatment, and also make sure that the support services we provide are culturally attuned to their needs. We can also advocate for community action that includes Indigenous voices and stay connected to avenues for policy and legislative advocacy that takes into account the impact of laws and policy changes on Indigenous people. Finally, Indigenous sovereignty and cultural experience should always be at the forefront of our mind when working with members of these communities to ensure we avoid perpetuating the ongoing historical and generational trauma they have experienced at the hands of colonizers.
Thank you, Michelle. Lastly, we included some web links to articles that talk a bit more about this issue and describe the photos included in this presentation. Finally, we have our references from this research as well as the census data used in this presentation. Thank you for joining us today, and we will talk to you next time.